So I'm Scott Hancock, who I assume you know. If you've read your schedule, I don't know what you know about me, if anything, but I teach here at Gettysburg College, been here since 2001. I am in the history department and in Africana studies. And I don't have the experience that you all have working every day with elementary, middle school, and high school students, and I'm not going to pretend to have that kind of insight. I did work in group homes for 14 years before I went into academia with young men and women who had made unfortunate decisions in their life path. I coach soccer at Gettysburg High School, so I keep my foot in with that age group, but what I do with them is very different than what you do. And in doing this today, my hope is to give you some tools, perhaps, that you can use in your classroom, but I'm not going to try and pretend that I'm an educator like you all, so that's not my main focus. My primary focus, and as I understand, I was looking at the schedule of the week, what you all have coming up is to give you some perspective on what the role of slaves, African Americans, is that leads to the Civil War, leads to Gettysburg, why perhaps that matters, as well as some of the debates that historians have about those roles, including debates between myself and Alan Gelzel, who you'll be hearing about later in the week. Alan and I get along fine. I think we have a good relationship. There are many things that we agree on about the history of the Civil War, and there are some things that we have significant disagreement on. But that's what critical thinking should be about, and something that we try to emphasize with our students, and I'm guessing that you all do with yours at different levels. And I don't know how you do critical thinking with elementary school students, but I'm sure you can. My youngest son teaches second grade in Brooklyn. Some of the stuff that he does with those second graders I think is amazing. So kids are smarter than they were when I was their age. So we're going to begin with the Prelude to Gettysburg and a couple organizing questions. So why is slavery a prelude to Gettysburg? This isn't a rhetorical question. Why is slavery a prelude to Gettysburg?
It starts the war.
Okay, it starts the war.
After Antietam, it becomes, the fighting, one of the main causes of the Civil War, at least outspoken.
Okay, so two possibly somewhat divergent answers or different answers.
It has an effect on who's going to win, because the slave states have them helping them with the chores, and then the northern states actually have to perform their own duties.
Okay.
So there's a ratio of fighting them with the slaves.
Okay.
Once Antietam occurred in the Emancipation Proclamation, it pretty well doomed getting the help from Europe. And so I think that really changed the complexion. Now Lee has to get that victory on Union soil. Whereas before he could have possibly gotten Europe involved. They may not have needed that.
Yeah, there's debate among historians about to what extent was that realistic, getting Europe involved as well. Any other thoughts?
Why is Gettysburg in quotes?
Yeah, I put it in there because, well, we'll get to that, but good question. I forgot I put it in quotes, but there is a reason for that. So the rest of the people you're hearing from this week, you're going on Underground Railroad tour this afternoon with Deb McCausland, which I might join you on that. And I know Deb, she's great, she's very enthusiastic, and has generated attention for the Underground Railroad and the small black communities that were in Adams County pretty much on her own. But other than that, the rest of the week, you're focused on the battle, on the Gettysburg Address, right? It's a pretty tight focus for the rest of the week. So why do you think you have this session this morning and this afternoon? What's the point?
Well, one point might be, I think the blacks kind of disappeared from the narrative of the Civil War for a long period of time. And it's fairly recently that they've come back in.
Yeah.
Not
And one of the ways they've come back in is a focus on black troops. We'll talk about that a little bit this morning, not much, especially with the movie Glory, 1988. How many have seen Glory? Yes. Like it? Yeah, great movie. I would also say, as a critical thinker, it's a white integrationist fantasy. But it's a good movie. They did a lot of things well in 1988. But and maybe we'll get to that as well. So slavery as a prelude to Gettysburg, this gets to what brought about the war as well, as some of you alluded to. But before I get this, the reason I have Gettysburg in quotes is because Gettysburg has certain connotations, right, beyond the town. So we say prelude to Gettysburg, we're talking about Gettysburg the battle, or we're talking about Gettysburg of November 19th when Lincoln comes and gives a Gettysburg address and commemorates and opens a national cemetery. And so which Gettysburg are we talking about? Are we talking about the Gettysburg, the town, the people that existed before the war, the first 2 years of the war, Gettysburg after? It has certain connotations, and it's not just in the United States. There was a radio show, an NPR show in Cleveland, and as you can imagine, 150th commemoration, there's a lot of stuff going on, and people calling people in Gettysburg, even calling me. I am not a Civil War expert. In fact, when they hired me, when they interviewed me for this job, I said, if you want somebody to do Civil War history, talk to somebody else. I view the Civil War as a minor skirmish in American history. I'm more interested in an earlier period when stuff actually mattered more. But being here, and they said, oh, we've got some more experts, and so that's fine. So I said, great. But being here, you can't help get pulled that way toward the Civil War as a historian, if you're an American historian. And so I've gotten dragged into some of this, and some of it is I find very fascinating. But so they were calling me as well. They'll call it Alan Gelzo and Peter Carmichael got far more attention than I did, and were far busier last year. But so this show in Cleveland, one of the people they talked to after they talked to me, this guy said that when Abraham Lincoln said, the world will little note or long remember, what we say or do here. And he said, yeah, that's true. Most people in the world, they don't know about Gettysburg. They don't know about the Gettysburg Address. They don't really care. I would disagree. That because I find it remarkable how often people in Eastern Europe or Russia or the UK or South America make reference, and I'm not saying it's ubiquitous that if you just talk to the average person on the street, they're going to know what Gettysburg is, because as you all probably know, many Americans don't know where Gettysburg is, right? When I moved here from Alabama, people said, oh, is that in Maryland? Where is Gettysburg exactly? Is that in the South? Although there are some people here who will say, yeah, Gettysburg is in the South. But it has a certain resonance still. And the Gettysburg Address is still considered by many people, not just the United States, as one of the most significant and famous speeches in history. And students in different parts of the world learn the Gettysburg Address, perhaps more than American students do today. So it still has some significance, I would argue. So the reason it's in quotes is because, as I said, I think it connotes a great deal. So we say a prelude to Gettysburg. Well, which Gettysburg are we talking about? So what I'm talking about here, this prelude to Gettysburg, is somewhat the war itself, Gettysburg as a signifying of this pivotal point. Although military historians will disagree, some say it wasn't all that pivotal. There's a debate about that, so I'm not going to get into that. As well as the Gettysburg Address and this notion of the new birth of freedom and what that means. So why is slavery prelude to Gettysburg as an organizing question? Organizing question about the prelude. I think the first question is, so what is the primary cause of the war? So you said slavery, right? I'm sorry, what's your name?
Jack.
So Jack said slavery. Would you agree, disagree, complicated? Now, when you talk about this in your classes?
Well, I think states' rights, to me, is what I understand the main thing to be, that the South didn't want to be told what they could do and didn't feel like they had to listen to what Lincoln was demanding of them. So that's why they seceded.
Okay.
Similar to what Jack said, but more precisely, I would say the expansion of slavery.
Okay.
I don't believe slavery was really challenged.
also to add on to that, slavery in the newer states, whether they would be slave states or not. But like when you first asked the question, I was thinking, well, it was an accident. It was like just random that these, two armies started shooting, and it was like a skirmish, and ended up being a major war.
Yeah.
Because of the way things happened, which weren't planned.
Yeah, and I'm not a military historian, although I love military history. I was an Army brat, so that's how I first got pulled into history. But you're absolutely right in the sense that it wasn't intended. Although Lee did have this idea, kept thinking there were different points before Gettysburg where he had planned to get into the North because he understood the kind of leverage it might give him. But there are actually some reasons why Gettysburg isn't entirely happenstance, because it sits at this nexus of crossroads. Gettysburg had a long history of doing business with Southern slaveholders in Maryland and Virginia. And so it is connected, and in a sense it sits at this border between slavery and freedom. And so in many ways it's very fitting that it becomes known in many ways as one of, if not the most important battle of the Civil War.
I mean, some historians would point all the way back to the founding of the United States, where states, joined the Union voluntarily, and so they could pull out at any time. You have the nullification resolutions in the 1820s and 1830s, and even the Kentucky and Virginia resolves, act speaking out against the Alien and Sedition Act, saying states can ignore the laws if they choose. So, but I would say, from what I read, slavery was the hugest issue. I mean, you have Alexander Stephens saying that was a cornerstone of the Confederacy.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
Differing economic paradigms?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I feel like it does sort of depend. The sense I have of it, and it's just a sense, is that for the Union, it was about preserving the Union and sort of federal dominance and the balance of that. But I feel like for the Confederacy, it really was about slavery, because it was just about states' rights. There have been other times in the past where the federal government tried to impose things and had overruled states' rights, and there had been no revolution then.
Right.
And in fact, the Confederacy itself was a huge bureaucracy. It was bigger than the one in Washington. So if it was really about states' rights, I feel that it couldn't have been, because they would have rebelled much sooner, much earlier,
Yeah.
or they would have not then themselves formed a huge bureaucracy, dominating over other states.
And part of the reason why in earlier periods, as you mentioned, that what the federal government is making decisions that seem to undermine this concept of states' rights, but there's no drive for secession. Well, who controls the federal government before 1860, 1858? Yeah, Southerners control it, right? When they're most unhappy with the federal government is when they lose the Supreme Court, they lose the House, they lose the Senate, they lose the presidency. That's when they don't like the centralized power of the federal government. I mean, there's always been some talk about that. I'm not saying they're all for it. But when they lost control of it is when they were most unhappy with it, which is human nature, right? We like power when we control it.
That sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? Yeah. Well, here's one, I think, easy way to frame it, for me anyway. And although I know oversimplification can often be dangerous. So about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's in the introduction to that book that you read, the Tradition Informs Us, this excerpt you read that I wrote. It's in the intro, and I don't think you read the intro, where I tell this story about how I took my youngest son, the one who's teaching in Brooklyn now. The one big observation tower on Seminary Ridge. So we were standing up there. He was like in 9th, 10th grade, I think. And my kids were homeschooled up through the first 8 grades, and then we shipped them off to Gettysburg High School. So he'd been in Gettysburg High School, it was the spring of his freshman year. Time of year. So we're standing up there looking over the battlefield. And I just happened to comment to him. I said, man, Isaac, just think, if all this death, all this happens just because of black people and the question of who's going to own them. And he starts saying, well, no, it's, there's states, there's tariffs and states' rights and blah, blah, blah. And I know there are legit, historians have debated this. And as you'll see as we go along, I don't agree with that perspective. And so I threw him off the tower. Walked down, picked him up. what are they teaching you at that school? Actually what I said to myself, well, Isaac, answer me this. If black people never come to these shores, if they don't arrive in 1619, or we think maybe even earlier now, there's some evidence even earlier, if they never come here, and if there's never Africans as slaves, do we have this Civil War? Maybe we have some other kind of war, but the Civil War that we had doesn't happen if there aren't slaves here. And I don't see how you can make the argument that the Civil War we had happens if slaves aren't part of the American story. The different economic paradigms, because of slavery.
It's culture. It's built into the culture.
Yes, absolutely. The culture
Plus,
of
it's built
society.
in, but it's built into the economic system as well.
It doesn't function without them.
It's, yeah.
And even though, and I understand that, so 25% of Southern households owned slaves in 1860. That's households, right? The person who actually owned the slave is the head of households. You're actually talking about 4% of white Southerners who owned slaves. So it's easy to say, to trot out those numbers and say, well, most Southerners weren't fighting for slavery. And then you'll frequently hear, well, most of the soldiers didn't own slaves.
Right.
Although there's more and more evidence suggesting that actually far more soldiers either owned slaves or were from slaveholding families than we had previously thought. That was a much bigger percentage. But regardless, we can say, well, your average grunt from East Tennessee, where there are actually a lot of people who went and fought for the Union, or parts of Arkansas, or North Carolina, or northwest Georgia. If they were fighting for the Confederacy, were they fighting for slavery? Well, most people, and as some of you probably know, historians and sociologists and others, when they talk to veterans, they say, when you're in the foxhole, what are you fighting for? What do you think they say?
Your budget.
Yeah, you're fighting for your life and for your buddy, right? You're not fighting for some great ideological cause at that moment. So understand all that, but we're not talking about what the soldiers fought for. We're talking about why the war came, why the Confederate government, right, what they were fighting for.
But we can't forget that the politicians of the South were slave owners. The educated,
absolutely.
the educated political machine of the South were mostly, so even though you're only looking at the 4%, they were the politicians. They were the ones making.
That 4%, what portion of the wealth of the South were those 4%? They had to be huge.
Oh, it's a huge percentage.
Huge.
Yeah. The richest county in the United States, even the Civil War, is Adams County, Mississippi. And you can replicate that in different parts all over the South. I mean, there are very poor counties in the South as well, although they tended not to be heavy slaveholding counties. But and sorry, what's your name?
My name, Rebecca.
As Rebecca said, it's part of the culture, right? It's part of the ethos. It's part of the political economic system. So historians talk about societies with slaves and slave societies. A society with slaves, you can talk, this isn't just in the United States, you could export this to any part of the world. A society with slaves is a society where slave holding is legal, but it doesn't prop up the society in any significant political, economic, or social way. So if you took the slaves out of that society, things would continue to function pretty much as they had. It would have minimal impact. So for instance, Connecticut owned slaves, right? There's slavery in Connecticut before the Revolution and after. There's slavery in Massachusetts. I mean, they say it ends in 1780. It actually continues a little bit longer here and there. But if you could imagine the wave of a wand and there are no slaves, it wouldn't have really made an impact. A slave society is a society where if you suddenly take those slaves out, there's going to be significant disruption, right? And that's the South. And that's places like Haiti before the Revolution, and Cuba and other places.
But I always try to talk to my kids as far as the economic aspect of it is imagine somebody comes to you and says, okay, it's illegal for you to own cars now.
Yeah.
You're not going to fight?
Yeah.
You're going to be pretty, I mean, that's going to have a huge impact on your life and on everything around you. You're going to fight over that.
Absolutely.
It ends up being the biggest property confiscation.
Right. Because that's your property, and that's a big portion of your wealth.
Well, that's what I tell my kids. I tell them, well, imagine if someone came in, and most of my kids are about 90% Latino. So I ask them, what if someone came to you and said, you cannot speak your language? Those stories that your mom tells you at night, she's not allowed to do that. The food you eat, you're not allowed to eat that anymore. So it runs deep.
Your life is going to be extremely different in a hurry, right? Yeah.
But when you actually look at the secession document. You take every state's secession document and their declaration of why they left. That will really confirm the primary cause, which is slavery.
We're going to do that.
Yeah.
We're going to do exactly that.
Also, is there no professional disagreement about historians anymore, that slavery was at the heart of the war?
I think you'd be hard pressed to find academic historians today, any legit academic historian who would argue otherwise. Now there's, there might be some minor debates about, well, is it the expansion of slavery or is it other aspects of slavery, but it all comes back to slavery. In popular culture, though, in the popular mind, it's still a subject of debate. But I would argue that it's tough to find a legitimate historian. So the military, you went through the visitor center, right? And they make it pretty clear that was a primary cause, right? It's one of the first things you walk through. And I remember Scott Hartwig, who was leading a lot of the research behind that. He is just recently retired. You're meeting with him later this week, right? Yes. I think he's up on your schedule. Great guy. But I remember when he was doing the research, he's down at the bottom of Musselman looking at primary sources, and he said, we, as him and the other park rangers were doing the research, because they wanted to get this question, not reading what historians said, just looking at the primary sources. He said it just comes up over and over and over again that it's so clear that the leaders of the Southern secession wanted to protect slavery. Just when you immerse yourself in the primary sources, there's no doubt about it. There's a newspaper in Richmond, I should have copied this one for you too, that in 1864 on their front page, they said, there are some of us who are saying, because they start to sense they're losing the war, there are some of us, white Southerners, who are saying that we didn't fight this war to protect slavery. That's a lie. So I mean, they were already then the revision was starting to begin, and they were resisting it then. But there's somebody up there.
I was going to say, I think throughout history, the cause of the war is never what the soldiers are fighting about.
Yeah.
There's always a propaganda thing to try and convince the soldiers that they're fighting for something else. We're not fighting for oil. Nobody wants to die over oil. Nobody wants to die over natural resources.
Yeah.
But, historically we know that that's what the causes of, imperialism and so forth, but that's not what the soldiers thought.
And some soldiers in different wars, they may sign up for ideological reasons, but once they're under fire, all the evidence suggests those things tend to become much less important. Okay, so it was longer than I intended on this. So anyway, so why Gettysburg, the battle? Slavery. When you go look at the field, I would just repeat the question I put to my son. If there aren't any black people here, we don't have this national military park here. So then the question also becomes, who's responsible for the new birth of freedom? Now when Lincoln uses this phrase, it's unclear, historians debate this, is he talking specifically and only about African American freedom? And I would say probably he's talking about more than that, but I would argue it's absolutely a big part of what he's referencing there and at the heart of it. But he means more than that. But we're going to hone in this morning on the new birth of freedom as it applies to African Americans, because this is more a source of ongoing debate among historians than what was the cause of the Civil War. So in relation to this, why is winning the war important for Lincoln and the Union? Part of it's to preserve the Union, right? Why else is winning the war important?
There was an election coming up.
Okay. Yeah.
Lincoln wanted to be reelected, and a lot of senators and all wanted to be reelected.
Yeah, and there's a couple of key military victories that perhaps helped him get reelected in '64, right? Because as you probably know, McClellan, they think might have been more open to negotiating for some kind of peace settlement. And by the way, Lincoln wins a landslide electorally. I think it's like 212 to 21. Popular vote, he gets about 2.2 million. McClellan gets 1.8. So there's a lot of white Northerners, and a few of the black people are voting. Most of the black voters probably voted for Lincoln, but they're inconsequential in terms of numbers. So there's a lot of white Northern men who are sympathetic to McClellan's position. So it's certainly Lincoln electoral landslide with popular vote is a little bit closer. Okay, so Lincoln wants to get elected. Why else winning the war critical?
You know, when I was a kid, it seems like American history was taught to me, this conflict was like, it was all to preserve the Union. And this is from a northern perspective in Minnesota. And it was all about slavery. That's how it was presented to me, and the more I dig into it, it really seems like it was.
Yeah.
But back to, it was to preserve the Union. I think that was almost like a somewhat false narrative. I mean, that's part of it, but I think it was an easy thing to say. Because there are so many, the more that I've read, the more I've determined that there are a lot of Northerners that were necessarily, they didn't have such strong feelings against slavery. Or maybe against slavery, but they for sure didn't want equal rights for blacks.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
So, anyway.
Yeah,
That's just what I want to say.
It's important, and I'm sorry if there are things that I say that you already know. I don't mean to be patronizing in any way. I just want to make sure. But as many of you know, there's an important distinction between abolitionists and anti-slavery, right? Most white Northerners are anti-slavery. Most of them are not abolitionists, and they're certainly not for equal rights.
Could you say that, I mean, nationalism in a sense of wanting to keep up with the Europeans, looking at us as a new country still relatively, we're expanding and, and wanting to make sure that we can survive and not, be another colony retaken over, like, without the Monroe Doctrine, so to speak.
Yeah. The American Republic is often called the Great Experiment in the decades before the Civil War, because nobody's really certain that's going to work. And according to Republican theory, not capital R Republican Party, but how the theory of how republics work around the American Revolution, the American Republic doesn't fit many of those theories. It's too big. It's not homogeneous enough. There's all kinds of structural problems that theoretically, that's not how republics were supposed to be, small and homogeneous and easy to control, and a host of other things. And so people are always wondering if it's going to work, and then as somebody mentioned, in 1820, you have a potential New England threatens to secede, you've got all these crises coming up, and so it's frequently called the Great Experiment, which, by the way, was one reason why when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who had been enemies during the Revolutionary period and become tight friends, when did they die? July 4th, 1820, 50 years to the day. I mean, what are the odds of that happening after the Declaration of Independence? 50 years to the day on the same day. And Americans at the time take this as a sign from God that it's going to work. Republic's going to work, because these two people became friends, and one of the dangers of the Republic is fraction and division. And look, these people were bitter political enemies from two very different regions, became tight friends, and they die and they go see their maker on the same day. So, yeah, it's called the Great Experiment, and the Civil War threatens that. So this preserving the Union is crucial, but you could preserve the Union without ending slavery. Right? There's these discussions during the war, before the war, and certainly during the war itself. Could we accept some modified form of a republic that's looser than it had been? But Lincoln and others don't think that's going to work. Right? They think it's going to fall apart at that point.
Slightly tangential, but didn't Lincoln also think that the republic was about, as he put it, lifting the burdens from men's shoulders? That it was a place where a common person could have a chance to improve themselves.
Yeah, like him.
And if this republic fell apart, that possibility of the world would be over.
Right. Alan Gelso has a line from a talk that he gave with McPherson, or not McPherson. Maybe it wasn't McPherson. This last spring at the Gettysburg Theater, I went to see it. I don't remember who was with him. But he has this line which I would not agree with entirely. You can. I was going to play part of the video from you, but for some reason the video isn't working. I don't know if it took it down. But he has this line in there about how the American Republic was the last stance against this rising aristocracy. And that the European aristocracy, and he has this line, this is something like, was going to ride people. The aristocracy, booted and spurred, would ride the common folks and dominate them. And so the American Republic stood against that, and if it fell apart, then that potential would fall apart as well.
Was it Peter Neely?
What's that?
Was it Neely?
No, it was not. I think it wasn't Pierce. But, somebody, it was two people that somebody else I didn't agree with on anything. But, okay, I'm not going to get into this significance of Gettysburg, the battle so much, but this notion of the Gettysburg Address and New Birth of Freedom, is it something more than simply black freedom, perhaps? But for African Americans, they certainly read this as a new birth of freedom was central to what the war was supposed to be about. They had been saying this before the war, certainly at the start of the war, they're saying it in the middle of the war, they're saying it at the end of the war. So the first document you have, there's one that starts off at the top, it says the Christian Recorder from 1863. So this is a black newspaper out of Philadelphia. They send a reporter, as many other places do, to hear all the ceremonies in November 19th, 1863, and this comes out in their paper a little while later, and if you just take a minute and read through that. How many words is the Gettysburg Address? How many versions of the Gettysburg Address are there? 5. Yeah, at least.
I didn't know.
Right, and I think probably more. Because we don't have an audio recording. And I don't know if any of you ever do this with your students where they have to copy down something that they hear orally. Right? And in illiterate societies, people don't do that well. So there's actually many versions of the Gettysburg Address, but no significant change, the preposition here or there. So this version I gave you has one important change. Did you catch it?
Or the tribal people?
What's that?
All the people?
Yeah. Right, so this black reporter, almost certainly male, sticks in the all at the end. So do you think Lincoln said it and everybody else left it out and he's the one who got it right? Or is that what he wanted to hear, so that's what he heard? Or did he intentionally, did he know Lincoln didn't say that, but he stuck it in to make a point?
We don't know.
Yes, he stuck it in?
No, but yes to all of this.
Yes.
I'll get it right somewhere.
That's a Lincoln-esque answer. I tend to think the latter, but I'm not certain. There's that Cleveland radio show I mentioned, there was another historian who came on after me, and he said something I had never thought of, that there's other language that Lincoln uses in several speeches and documents in the years before the Gettysburg Address, even before he was president, where he does talk about the government being for all the people. And so, and he does, this historian didn't know either, but he wasn't aware of this article, but he said it made him wonder if perhaps Lincoln did say that. Although I haven't seen another version where this all is stuck in there, which suggests that perhaps he didn't. It's hard to think that. A lot of people have got it wrong. But in oral societies where literacy rate is low and communication happens primarily orally through storytelling, oral traditions, and things like that, which is African society and African American and slave society. Black Northerners, not as much. Their ability to retain information that they hear orally. So if they do the exercise that maybe if you have your students do, they'd be much more likely to get it right. And perhaps he was the one who got it right, although I think it's probably unlikely. But there's I think it's a telling insertion there, and I think he clearly thought the new birth of freedom meant African Americans. And if the new birth of freedom focuses on African Americans, we think about it that way, and then thinking about, well, then who's responsible? Who gets credit for that new birth of freedom? Is it Lincoln? Is it the North? Is it the soldiers? Is it African Americans? This is a subject of ongoing debate. There is a historian named Vincent Harding, another one named Liam Litwack, who wrote a book called Been in the Storm So Long, and others who argued about 20 years ago that African Americans were the ones who pushed Lincoln toward it, and they actually get far more of the credit.
I've always been taught that Lincoln did not believe, as most white people at the time did not believe in racial equality at that time. And yet, you know, he brings up all men are created equal. So had his opinions changed at all? Or, I mean, why does he say it if he didn't believe it?
Or was he just a really good politician? Who knew?
Yeah, or a lawyer.
That's how I like to look at Lincoln, is he was just a great politician.
And he was.
So it's kind of like in education where you either stand back and things happen and you're left behind and you become that veteran teacher and you don't change the way you do things, or you say, you know what, Common Core's coming in, I gotta go with it.
Yeah.
See, that's why I was scared to bring it up for a second, but Alexander Stephens is from my home state. And in his collection, there is a letter from Lincoln begging him not to secede from the Union, telling Alexander Stephens, I'm not going to touch slavery.
Yeah, he said that many times.
You know, the thing about, did he change? I think he did. I think he was a great politician. He changed with the times.
Yeah.
In the debate with Stephen Douglas in 1858, Lincoln defines equality. It's the only time he ever defines it. And he defines it in 3 different aspects. He says there's political equality, there's economic equality, and there's civic equality. And there's no doubt that Abraham Lincoln believed in the economic equality of all men, potentially all women.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back to his early writings, he introduces a bill in the Illinois state legislature for women to have the right to vote. On several occasions. He comes to Washington, D.C. and wants to have free blacks in Washington, D.C., several caveats.
And there's caveats the other direction as well.
Yes. But to suggest that Abraham Lincoln is incapable of growth over a period of time, and to suggest that Abraham Lincoln did not harbor the ideas of civic, political, and economic equality as early as 1848 is to deny his own writings, which he's not writing as a politician in 1848 and 1858. He's writing as a private citizen that's not even on the lay of the land. He's been rejected for the United States Senate. He's lost a congressional seat.
Yeah.
I just think that does a great disservice to the actual record.
Then why does Lincoln, and this is something, by the way, that Alan Gelzo would probably disagree with vehemently, but I would argue that he's absolutely wrong because I think there's strong evidence. Why does Lincoln, after the Emancipation Proclamation, after he's been reelected, still investigate colonization? That he seems to want these people out of the country.
Here's my answer to that after multiple years of thinking about it and reading about it. Abraham Lincoln, after the Cherokee incident in Haiti, has proof that compensated emancipation is not going to work. And if you read the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, and you can go searching tonight, he never mentions this compensated emancipation again after the Cherokee incident.
So I'm not sure how that answers the question.
The answer to the question is he tries compensated emancipation. He tries it in 3 different formats. They all fail. The one in the Cherokee incident.
I'm talking about colonization. I'm talking about moving black people out of the country.
Well, that's what he's talking about, compensated emancipation with relocation.
You could have compensated emancipation without relocation.
Yeah.
Yes,
you could compensate slave owners.
He offers
make African Americans equals politically, civically, economically, socially. You could acknowledge the fact that this country in 1864, 1865 would not be the same country it was without the labor of generations of black people. And you could make the argument, which African Americans made, that they shouldn't leave the country because it was their country. They bled, died here, worked here, helped produce the wealth. So why should they leave? But Lincoln is still, he's not just pushing for a compensated emancipation, with, as you said, with relocation. And the reason I raise this question, because it goes to this question about, well, is Lincoln a savvy politician? So Lincoln in the summer of 1862, he has 5 black guys from Baltimore come to the White House. I think it's the first time he had these black people come to the White House, as you may know. And he tells them, it basically says, the war is your fault. If you folks weren't here, we wouldn't have this war. And there are some historians who would argue that this is political gamesmanship to signal to white Northerners that he's not for the social equality because he's setting up the release of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862. Right? That he's kind of setting the stage for this. He doesn't want a strong backlash from white Northerners. I believe that's probably true, but I also believe that Lincoln believed what he said.